Indeed. As Canada embarks on this discussion as a country already with the second highest rate of youth cannabis use in the world, I think you have two choices when it comes to this policy change in this arena. First, lawmakers can listen to public health advocates and people with essentially no financial incentives for policies to pass. This disinterested group grounds its perspective on scientific evidence and the legacy of other legalized drugs. We've already legalized drugs. They're called alcohol, tobacco, prescription pharmaceuticals. Based on that information, most of these associations, folks working in public health, reject legalization in favor of a modified cannabis reform, which would remove criminal penalties, not punish users, but at the same time not normalize, advertise, promote, and essentially commercialize cannabis. I think there's been a false dichotomy set up between you have to either criminalize or you have to legalize, and I think that is a false dichotomy. Now, if that can't be done and the decision's been made, then I would say a policy of discouragement and deterrence centered around strong science-based regulations and messages about cannabis use outcomes is certainly preferred to the policy of putting business people over public health and safety. Now, alternatively, you can disregard scientists and you cannot listen to the public health and safety experts, as well as your international treaty obligations under the United Nations, and instead listen to those with a financial stake in promoting, normalizing, and legalizing cannabis. These lobbyists and the interests they represent will make a great deal of money if cannabis is legal. The more people use, the more they will earn. And we know that the consequences of this approach from the world's experience with tobacco, our biggest global public health disaster, denying science on negative effects, promoting the use to children and other vulnerable populations, and manipulating the drug to enhance its addictive effects and thus its profitability. Sadly, in my country, in the United States, we've taken the latter route. It has already produced negative consequences, although, of course, the full spectrum of negative consequences will not be seen for probably decades to come. Mental illness, schizophrenia, psychosis, these things don't happen overnight. We know that cannabis use is at least up compared to the rest of the country in jurisdictions with legalization. A commercial industry rife with lobbyists is regularly undermining proper regulation. That's why in places like Oregon, you see billboards without disclaimers. You see coupons, you see brightly colored edibles. So these were supposed to be regulated out of the market, and there are concerns with drugged driving. Now, I've worked on this issue for over 20 years. I look at this from a nonpartisan perspective. I've served most recently in the Obama administration, where I was privileged to help draft the president's national drug control strategy, which shifted our approach to a public health approach. I've also served folks in other parties. I have advised in the UK when I was before and after my PhD studies at Oxford. I am gravely concerned with the direction we're going on this, because modern high-grade cannabis is not the cannabis of old. We've learned to manipulate the THC levels, and that is why I co-founded with Patrick Kennedy, the son of the late Senator Ted Kennedy, a group called Smart Approaches to Marijuana. We joined the major public health and safety organizations in flat-out rejecting legalization as good public policy, but also rejecting criminalization and arresting people for small-time use. But we are very concerned with the kinds of products that cannabis now comes in terms of attractive, kid-friendly edibles like candies, ice cream, sodas, which account for a large portion of the cannabis market in legalized states. Now, I think legalization and industrialization is responsible for these products. Let's be very clear. There is no effective way to mass produce highly potent products without access to technology and capital that legalization allows. And I'm very concerned that we're seeing former provincial leaders, people in the public good, having left their positions now, and we're seeing announcements of joining and starting companies and being involved in the cannabis business and using that inside information. With regards to health, you've heard from people who have studied this much more extensively than me, like the Quebec Association of Psychiatrists and others. There is no debate about the negative consequences, the long-term consequences, especially of heavy cannabis use on young people. Canadian youth will be less marketable, frankly, on the global marketplace if use goes up and continues to go up. They will not be able to be competing in terms of versus other countries. I think that is a real issue. I think the workplace is a real issue as well, and employer and employment safety safety. I'm not going to go through the entire testimony here. I will submit it to the record in terms of what for example, on page 3, what the National Academy of Sciences have said. In my country, the top scientists just met and released the most extensive scientific review that's ever been released in the world on the negative health effects of cannabis. I urge you to consult that. I also urge you to consult the surveys that have been done on youth use around the country. Some of the ones that Andrew referred to talk about the issue of emergency room admissions, and we have data from Colorado and Washington on that as well. And sort of for the interpreters, sort of moving on to page 5, as well as the issue of youth use and emergency room admissions, I think the black market is a serious concern. We are deluding ourselves if we think that major drug trafficking organizations will not exploit every chance they get a way to be legitimized through the legal market. We're seeing this in other states. We're also deluding ourselves to think that they will go away and not try to undercut the government price of cannabis. Economies rule the day here in terms of price. The lower the drug price, the more likely someone is to use. And the illegal market can easily undercut the legal market. In fact, a leaked report in March from the Oregon State Police has found that 70% of the market for cannabis in that state, which legalized some years ago, is still from the black market. The quote of that report said, "The illicit exportation of cannabis must be stemmed as it undermines the spirit of the law and integrity of the legal market. It steals economic power from the market, the government, and citizens, and furnishes it to criminals, thereby tarnishing state compliance efforts." In 2016, Seattle police spokesman noted that large-scale illegal grows are still prevalent, and they do come across that. Another issue that was brought up was drug driving. The issue of a recent study by the Canadian Center on Substance Abuse and Addiction put the cost of impaired driving from cannabis at $1 billion. What happens if the use of cannabis increases by 1%, by 5%, by 10% as a result of normalization? We can, sort of debate about which data sets are best for drug driving, but AAA, the Insurance and Traffic Safety Foundation, found a large increase in Washington State, for example, in recent cannabis users getting involved in fatal car crashes. And we know from science that cannabis about doubles to triples your risk of a crash because of reduced reaction time, etc. On the bottom of page 6, costs are very important. Please do not think that there will not be regulatory and enforcement costs under legalization. Now, a lot of people are stunned. They say, well, wait a minute, we're getting rid of enforcement, we thought. Well, actually, no. You will have to invest in the enforcement of the rules that you create. And so, for example, in the U.S., the #1 drug of arrest is not heroin, it's not marijuana, it's not crack, it's alcohol. That's underage users, DWIs, and public use. And if surveys of Canadians of recently are of any interest to anybody, I think the public use of cannabis, the nuisance of secondhand smoke, the issue of multi-home dwellings is going to be a very big nuisance, a very big issue, and that's why, for example, the apartment associations said what they did, and I agree with them. As Andrew talked about, it's also not a tax windfall. If you're going to talk about revenues, let's talk about costs as well. You cannot look at one side of the ledger. It's a bad way to look at any business, is to look at only revenues. Well, what are the costs? What are the costs to Canada in terms of drug driving, public safety, public health, etc.? Finally, no policy change should occur without a commitment to better data collection. I don't think there has been a good data collection, unfortunately, so far in Canada. However, robust data allows us to shape and change policy. There are a lot of things to look at. I include in my testimony. As I said, I wholeheartedly agree with the recommendations of most of your health organizations and other associations that realize there will be real victims from this policy change. The government should therefore commit itself to reducing the number of victims as much as possible and discourage and deter. So, in summary, slow down. The only people that benefit from speed in this issue are the business people that are really waiting to get rich. There is no benefit to going fast on this issue at all. I share the concerns of provinces like Saskatchewan and Manitoba who have raised alarm about the issue of age and the speed at which this is going. And I understand it may be too late, but I still think that foregoing legalization in favor of reducing criminal sanctions and deterring marijuana use is the best way from public health. If, despite the best available evidence showing it would ultimately harm public health, you do go ahead and go with legalization, I recommend, and we recommend, raising the age limit, as the Canadian Medical Association said, to 25. The brain isn't fully developed until about age 30. 25 seems rational. Commence a discouragement and deterrence campaign. Limit the profitability of any retail outlets, for example, with the government-owned stores that are totally nonprofit, plain packaging. We can't do no advertising and commercialization, unfortunately, in the U.S. because of that little thing called the First Amendment, which we find, and I do, very important and very good. In this case, it hurts us in the U.S. because of commercial speech being protected as free speech. Hopefully, you can find a way to have the reduced commercialization. And defending the rights of non-users and the victims, the children, the vulnerable populations. Where are the marijuana stores going to show up? Are they going to be in the rich neighborhoods, or are they going to be in the most vulnerable ones? That's a huge issue. In the United States, there are 8 times as many liquor stores in poorer communities of color. And I think Canada should listen to business groups, housing associations, and medical associations, as you are now, before formulating any policy, as well as committing yourself to a robust data collection effort. Thank you.
Thank you.